We're back with Dr. Robert Porwell, and today he will speak about Hugh of St. Victor. And I think Robert Porwell is one of the living experts on Hugh of St. Victor. So it's wonderful to have him do a presentation. Please, Robert.
Thank you, Adrian, for having me on. This is a wonderful project you have going. I'm glad to be back. Today we'll talk briefly about Hugh of St. Victor and try to give a kind of introduction to how to read and how to understand Hugh. My name is, as Adrian said, Robert Porwell, and here we go. So, who is Hugh of St. Victor? Unlike some of the great medieval giants, he's one that often gets left out. You might say, who is this Hugh fellow? This would be a strange thing for medievals who would expect Hugh to be understood as one of the great giants of spiritual, of contemplative, and of educational theology in our minds. He was much beloved, widely appreciated among very different kinds of folks, different kinds of readers, and for many centuries. He was the founding luminary of a school at the Order of St. Victor here seen in the 17th century, I believe, just outside of Paris. He was a teacher at the Abbey of St. Victor in its external school, so folks coming in from outside, as well as a kind of master for the canons regular in the Abbey, and as well a kind of groundbreaker for the constellation of thinkers that become known as the School of St. Victor, or simply the Victorines. One of Hugh's great appreciators is actually Bonaventure. Bonaventure, when he, in the latter century, is going over the important things to be reading, the important parts of theology, he breaks theology or sacred scripture down to three main headings. First regards faith, second regards morals, and the third, the purpose of both, the more contemplative. He writes, to the study of the first, this is the faith, doctors, and here he means university masters, should devote themselves. To that of the second, morals, preachers should concentrate. And to the attainment of the third, contemplatives should aspire. So three different classes, three different functions of studying theology for different purposes. Augustine is the chief exponent of the first class on faith, and Gregory of the second on morals, and Dionysius on the third. Anselm follows Augustine, Bernard follows Gregory, Richard of St. Victor, here we have another Victorine here coming in again, follows Dionysius. For Anselm excels in reasoning, Bernard excels in preaching, and Richard excels in contemplation. But Hugh of St. Victor excels in all three. For Bonaventure, Hugh is a kind of universal master of teaching the faith in morals, in spiritual life, as well as in the more mystical contemplative side. This is pretty high praise coming from someone like St. Bonaventure. There has been a kind of recovery in the last century in terms of reading Hugh and the Victorines. The movement called Ressourcement has sent us back to rereading biblical patristic exegesis, medieval exegesis, including that of Hugh. There's been some work done by scholars on the scholastic syntheses of the 13th century who have looked at Hugh, and especially his On the Sacraments of the Christian Faith, as a kind of precursor for some of these great works by Alexander of Hales, Peter Lombard, Bonaventure, and Thomas. In the mid-20th century, there began a much more appreciation for Hugh's exegetical work, especially his historical or literary exegesis of the Bible, and this being an important part of Hugh's educational plan, an important part of how Hugh sees the Bible to be understood and read correctly. After that, in more recent decades, Hugh, as a spiritual and an intellectual master, some of his other sides have sought and gained appreciation. What we will talk about today is Hugh as a kind of church reformer, that Hugh's educational, spiritual, and contemplative sides are serving a larger purpose in the clerical and monastic reform movements of his time. So, what about his life? He doesn't have a tremendously tumultuous or political life. He sort of eschews the spotlight in some ways. He seems to have come out of Saxony from German roots. He gained his education from clerics, not from monks, but from clerics, from canons regular in Hammersleben, or maybe just simply canons. He travels with his uncle, also named Hugh, to Marseille, and he acquires in Marseille relics of Saint Victor. He brings these notably to Paris, where he brings them and presents them to this new abbey of Saint Victor outside the walls in Paris. He's welcomed in to Saint Victor around 1117 or so, and joins up with them. He's not the abbot, but he quickly gains the confidence of the abbot Gilduin of Saint Victor. So early in the 1120s, we already find him as a master in the schools of Saint Victor. Through his 20-year career in teaching at Saint Victor, he is seen quickly as a prominent luminary in theology, in spirituality, and in reform. Even in his own lifetime, he gains a reputation as an Alter Augustinus, a second Augustine, which for us, this would be something like a second Einstein or a second Isaac Newton, right? This is pretty high praise to gain in his time and place in his own lifetime. During his teaching career, then, he establishes the school as an important site of theology and spirituality, and as we'll see, an important reserve or resource for the church in a larger international way. And then he dies in 1141. Hugh's life, though apparently unremarkable in some of the events, take place in this Parisian context, which does have tumult and rapid change and a high intensity of drama. He is just outside of Paris, and so as we'll see, he has a kind of link to Paris, but not subsumed by the currents of the whirlpool of Paris. Paris is a rising city that's benefiting at this time from a convergence of different movements. What we call the 12th century Renaissance is taking place in Paris with an urban revival. There is more prosperity. There's a kind of rising middle class. There's an urban revival with traders and commerce taking place in cities. And as a result, more career and social political mobility than there has been in the past. Also in Paris, we have the Capuchin court. The Capuchins, the French monarchical dynasty, has settled in Paris and making this its more permanent capital. And a lot of governmental reforms are taking place. Louis VI is following up on his father's move to revive this dynasty and revive the Kingdom of France. And there's a lot of work going on in this way. Also, this is a center of clerical, episcopal, and various other church reform movements, a kind of network around Paris of important reforming folks. Among these folks, there's ties to the new schools that are arising in this urban revival. We have the new schools of this 12th century Renaissance. William of Champeaux stands out as an early and important master in these new schools, who's teaching in the very heart of Paris in Notre Dame. And another school nearby, the Abbey on top of Mount Saint-Geneviève, is an important school. Abelard settles there for some time. It's become his favorite haunt for a while. There becomes a kind of attraction to the street of Saint-Jacques, which the central avenue that many masters and many new teachers take up and establish their own schools, renting rooms, establishing their own schools on this famous street, which will become the heart of the emerging corporation that becomes the University of Paris a century later. So in this sort of dynamic urban ferment, we have many students looking for careers, flocking to Paris because that's where some famous teachers are, and more teachers start coming to Paris because that's where flocks of students are. So there's a kind of ascending spiral taking place here. The Abbey of Saint Victor then is a beneficiary of this. It's not caught up in the middle of it, but it's near it. The Abbey of Saint Victor is a beneficiary of several of these converging movements. This location to the city, it receives a great deal of royal patronage. Louis VI is a big supporter of the Abbey, as well as prominent reform members. The Capuchins and the reformers don't always get along, to say the least, but they can play, or they can receive patronage and support from both sides. Many of the students arriving in Paris, hoping to study with famous teachers, will also hear about this school just outside the walls, just a kilometer away or so, and will also walk out and get involved in this new school of Hugh just outside of Paris. And so the Victorines and Hugh have this interesting tension between being part of the Parisian scene, but also slightly different. We can see a map here of the medieval Paris, and we see the red dot in the middle, Notre Dame, sort of an epicenter of some of this, with the street coming out of it a little bit down and a little bit to the side. Saint-Geneviève is this dot a little bit further down, closer to the bottom, and then just a little bit over, we say Saint Victor. So a kind of in Paris or close to Paris, but not quite of Paris. This tension we see in a later Victorine named Godfrey of Saint Victor. He writes a kind of poem of the fountain of philosophy. And in this poem, he writes about this grand vision of the arts of philosophy, that is to say, the liberal arts of philosophy, of the study of sacred scripture as ways to reach wisdom, but in the schools of Paris, right, all flocking around this river Seine in the middle of Paris. The students are going thirsty. They're not getting their thirst quenched. They're not receiving the wisdom that they're seeking, Godfrey is portraying, until like they go outside the walls, away from the center of the city, and to the fountain of philosophy in Saint Victor. Away from the river is the true fountain of wisdom. And he writes here in terms of this metaphor of drinking in, of flowing wisdom. From there, he pours, this is what takes place at Saint Victor. He pours out instruction for the unlearned and provides teaching for those who know nothing. For them, he gives consolation to weak souls and offers exhortation to those advancing, to those who are moving, exhortation to continue moving, to those who are too weak, consolation, to those who know nothing, the beginning of wisdom. So Saint Victor is playing this strange balance. It's part of the Parisian scene, but it's also distinct from it. In this kind of balanced position, Hugh is intentionally using his school and his abbey as a kind of laboratory. He's experimenting in his classroom. He's also experimenting, developing a kind of spiritual life in the abbey, the life of his fellow canons. We find in Hugh's perhaps most famous work, the program of reading that he sets out. This is a famous work that has been reprinted and appreciated in recent decades. The Didascalicon sets out 3 books on the study of the liberal arts and the study of the sacred scriptures. It is tempting to see Hugh's statement of classical education as a kind of medieval synthesis or a consensus or classic view, something that a touchstone that many could look at and agree upon. This has the danger, I think, of losing the fact that Hugh's argument in the Didascalicon is controversial. This is not something that all would have accepted. This is not a consensus position. Many agreed with him, many did not. What we find in the Didascalicon is a critique of the Parisian schools closely nearby. What Hugh sees when he looks into the schools is disorderly teaching instead of integration, instead of a curriculum through which the masters are patiently and carefully leading their students. We find a kind of hopping or hopscotch going around. It's fragmentary. You study this, you might study that, you might go around, you get bored with this, and so you move on. Students ask questions about X, so you go and you talk about X for a little while. There's no set curriculum or set order to the studies. On the other hand, there's a great reliance on talent. The teachers rely too much on their talent instead of having a deep wells of understanding. We see the worry that the teachers will simply come up with answers through their own wit and ingenuity on the spot, answering questions spontaneously that students bring to them. On the other hand, Hugh was worried in the Didascalicon and throughout his writings about students imitating their teachers, also relying upon their talent, instead of students slowly, patiently gaining a kind of knowledge from foundation through structure, then refinement. We have students who are leaping immediately to the heights, trying to leap immediately to achievement and raise themselves to the position of a master too quickly. And by the result of this, by this overzealous or over hasty leap to fall headlong, as Hugh writes. Hugh's Didascalicon then diagnoses this problem, this reliance on talent without order, and sets out to give a better view, a more mature understanding of how talent should be cultivated and in what order it should be cultivated, the methods of reading and study. He already indicates this in his preface. He writes at the very beginning, there are many whom nature has left so destitute in talent that they can scarcely grasp by their intellect even easy things. And yet he will say, even these destitute ones in talent, these dull ones, they can still make better progress if they have the right kind of method, if they're walking the right kind of path. There is another sort, and this is whom Hugh finds most worrisome. There's another sort whom nature has exceedingly enriched with talent and offers the way to come to truth as easy. These are folks who should be able to arrive at truth easily, in whom, though the strength of their talent is above par, nevertheless, the virtue and will for cultivating the natural sense through exercises and teaching is not the same for all. The talented are really the problem, Hugh sees. They have this ability, but they may not have the virtue, this moral, spiritual foundation, or the will, right? The resolve to undertake a slow, careful, process of exercise and teaching. What Hugh's Didascalicon does then is try to hold back the talented from overleaping and to give order for the more dull, the less talented, so that they can maintain progress despite their the lack of luster in their intellectual capacities. He writes then, for there are 3 lessons especially necessary for reading. These are the 3 things that you need in order to make progress. First, one must know what each one should read. The quid, what do we read? Second, one must know in what order, quo ordine, in what order one should read. What you read first, what you read later. If you read in the wrong order, Hugh thinks, it's going to be wasted effort. And third, in what manner, quo modo, one ought to read. Hugh's Didascalicon then sets up these 3 questions for the liberal arts, broadly construed as philosophy, what they are, in what order you read them, and what method to read them, what method to understand them, and similarly for the sacred scriptures. This larger pedagogical critique and plan is part of this larger reform movement taking place at St. Victor, and that Hugh, though he's not explicitly writing letters and agitating and getting involved in politics like his friend and colleague Bernard of Clairvaux might be doing, that Hugh is contributing to this reform movement in a deeper and perhaps broader way. He turns St. Victor into a kind of nursery for church reformers. It's a formation in teaching, doctrina, as well as in disciplina, for virtue. This is highly attractive to many, and many students come, the best and the brightest, you might see coming to St. Victor, and it has a very broad and widely respected reputation. Their prestige, right? They receive patronage from Louis VI and from others. Their reputation for their learning, their example and their virtue are like a beacon to many. So many come to St. Victor or get in touch by letters or by messengers to St. Victor, asking Victorines, a group of Victorines, to come to their own religious house, their own convent, their own monastery, their own gathering, their canonry, right, their own church with canons, to reform it, to get it, to help them clean up their act, right? They realize that we're not living quite the right way. We've strayed from our rule. We need someone to help us reform, and they invite Victorines to come. They might also invite Victorines to come take over as a prior or as an abbot when they have an empty office, right? We can't simply have Victorines visit us. We need a Victorine to now lead us, right, to become our next abbot, our next prior. And so through this kind of spontaneous growth, there's an order of St. Victor, like we have various monastic and religious orders. The order of St. Victor is growing by this invitation method. Victorines are plucked out and have this inordinate, almost underground effect on the church in England and France and Italy and Germany and all around their vicinity. We find a later Victorine in the 12th century, early 13th century, I think, aware of this deeper understanding. In the Chronica Abbreviata, we find this recognition how the order of St. Victor has spread through many churches. And the chronicler writes about a dozen folks who've gone on to high positions of leadership and are having influence in their areas. Radulphus, Odo, Roger, another Roger, Garnarius, Baldwin, Guibert, another Richard, an Andrew, very famous Andrew at Wigmore in England, and even another Ivo. I think there's 2 Ivos of St. Victor. One of the Ivos goes and becomes a cardinal, pulled and selected by the Pope. These are what happens to the students of Gildwyn and of Hugh of St. Victor, as well as Richard, who comes later. This is where they go, into these positions of high leadership. This is notable because within the writings of Hugh, within the writings of the Victorines, we find very little mention of ambition or expectation that Victorines will be going. They're not aiming for this. This is not their goal in life. Like some clerics seem to be highly ambitious in their careers and go into the church offices for a wealthy career. Abelard accuses Willie of Champeau of this kind of ambition. We don't find this in the Victorine work, but this is what takes place because of their spiritual and intellectual formation. If one is going to read Hugh, we haven't here introduced specific works, specific ideas, or specific themes, but here are some major categories that one might be interested to start looking at Hugh. I would argue that these all should be read in terms of his larger pedagogical project. He's not just going from different topic to different topic, that each of these writings plays a part of this larger tapestry, of this pedagogical project that he spends his career crafting for his canons. To look at his pedagogical program, his thinking about education in the liberal arts, I think you should look at the Didaskalikon for certainly, but also the newly translated Formation of Novices, which is in the Victorine Text and Translation series. For philosophy, Hugh has a lot of thinking. He has an early commentary on Dionysius's hierarchy. The Epitome of Dindybus for philosophy, his 3 days, or on the 3 days, is an important work, as well as his homilies on Ecclesiastes. It's a kind of set of spiritual exercises, reading in the classical sense, reading Ecclesiastes. Hugh's biblical exegesis, as we've said before, is something that is famous and well noted. His notes on the Pentateuch or other biblical texts are very interesting. Hugh was in touch with rabbis in the school of Rashi and others in northern France. We're learning, and there's bridges being built here. He also has another account of how one reads and understands the scriptures in his short work on the sacred scriptures and their authors. For his theology, his arc treatises, his in the classroom sentences on divinity, and his sacraments of the Christian faith are key works as well. You can find many of these now in this tremendous series, the Victorine Texts and Translations series. Breppels is heading this up. There are 6 in this pictured on the slide here, but there are more than that. So I highly recommend that, maybe picking 1 or 2 of them and looking and see what topics or what you're interested in reading. Paul Roram and his Great Medieval Thinkers volume is a tremendous introduction to Hugh, as well as Ivan Illich's In the Vineyard of the Text. Here we have a focused study of Hugh's Didaskalikon, the kind of reading that Hugh is asking us to do in the Didaskalikon. And I'm contractually obligated to mention 2 other edited volumes, the companion to the Abbey of St. Victor, a lot of very fine articles in this by colleagues and friends, tremendous, something to check out. Shows the sort of cutting edge research, and as well something that I was involved with, the Victorine restoration, tremendous essays by scholars here as well. That wraps it up on my side. I can hand it back to you, Adrian.
Thank you very much, Robert, for this rich groundwork, and this sets us up for a deeper study of probably a lesser known aspect of history of Christianity, which is the Victorine, the school of St. Victor and its many representatives. Let me ask you one question about the goal of education as Hugh of St. Victor envisages it, right? He was invested in it. He wrote about it. And how does this goal of education tie into, let's say, his more mystical theological works?
This is a good question. This is a tough question. I probably could have gone into this in the presentation. So thank you for this question. This is a tough one in some ways because it's so encompassing. Hugh, in his thought as well as his pedagogical practice, takes two main views of things. There's the creation, and then there's restoration. And he talks in a great deal about the creation, the conditio, as well as the restoration, which is the redemption, the restoring, the renewal of creation after sin. With creation, there's this tremendous possibility, this tremendous potential in the trajectory that is intended in creation. But then with sin, there's this great lapse, right? There's the weakening of the intellect, and there with ignorance, and the darkening of the intellect and the weakening of the will in some ways. And also the weakening of the body. He looks at the body as an important part of what is hurt in the advent of sin and the fall. Education for Hugh is part of this larger salvific process. It's part of the plan of redemption. Christ brings the possibility of redemption and brings the actuality of redemption through grace, through the sacrifice of the cross, through the bringing in of the sacraments, through the church, through which then we can gain part. And education is one of the ways that the salvific process can be enacted in our souls. We through grace receive greater light for our darkened intellects. We receive the sort of straightening for our wills that have been bent with concupiscence. And also we have the mechanical arts, which are there. The mechanical arts, these are another set of arts. They're not liberal arts, but they're things like armor making and textiles and agriculture, blacksmithing, things like this. These are actual arts because we need them to strengthen and to nourish our bodies, right? So these play a role in this kind of restoration. Hugh's pedagogy then, including our intellectual, including our will or our virtue, is part of this larger sacramental salvific upsurge. In the higher reaches of this upsurge, right? We start with the alphabet for our intellect. We start with our, rules and protocols in discipline to help our will. In the higher reaches of this upsurge, that's where the mystical parts will come in this sort of upward ascension of the mind into the heart and even the body into grace, into the salvific trajectory. So he will write some very mystical, very contemplative writings as well that will sort of be probing into this kind of these kind of higher reaches. In his formation of novices, he said he takes as a important slogan, right? Teach me goodness, teach me knowledge, and teach me virtue. But then he reverses this slogan, and this is from Psalm 118, and you have to first learn virtue, then learn wisdom or knowledge, and then you can get through grace goodness, right? This higher you can get bonitas through these higher reaches, and even from the very beginning of entering this pedagogical plan, right? That's the sort of end point that he's aiming his canons, his students to reach. There's some thoughts. Any further questions? Any other things to look into?
Beautiful. Thank you. And I know you've written your dissertation it's a very rich dissertation about pedagogy, right, in Hugh of St. Victor, John of Salisbury, and Abelard, if I remember correctly. And what do you take from that study? What did you learn, and especially from Hugh, for you as an educator, right? Because you are a dedicated teacher. What do you think we can still learn and apply from Hugh today in American academia, so to speak?
This is a good question, one I really haven't fully digested. I'm still thinking about it in some ways. I think as an initial answer, though, one of the things that Hugh is very psychologically attentive to is the memory. Hugh doesn't think that we should be learning vast amounts of information by rote for verbatim recitation, but to have the ability to take a vast amount of information and to reduce it down into a kind of digest or summary, which he calls a summa. The summas will become a new genre, but Hugh already is writing summas, which are very compact reductions, digests of a great deal of information, and then committing this to memory so you keep it in the storehouse, the treasure chest of your memory. He was a kind of theorist of memory, as people like Mary Carruthers and others have revealed to us and pointed out. And he is doing this for specifically pedagogical reasons. This is how he wants his students to gain and retain the conceptual riches of all this, the reading that he's doing. He doesn't expect us to memorize, right, Boethius's Consolation de Heptamadibus and memorize vast amounts of information just in their entirety, but to have the ability to reduce them into their conceptual forms oftentimes. And he does give us information in order to maintain a whole great deal of information. But he also points out that the memory loves brevity. So the more you can abbreviate things, reduce them down to their conceptual essence, the better for holding on to. I think this, to answer your question, Adrian, is a very important thing to be meditating on in terms of our own teaching today, recognizing that the media and the media technology that all of us are swimming in is not good for our memories. Our memories suffer as a result of this. And so finding ways to present and help students retain summas, as it were, of a vast collection and network of ideas, conceptual depth and richness, in ways that they can hold on to that, I think is something I'm experimenting with and trying to do an imitation of Hugh.
Thank you. And as you were presenting the Didascalion, what strikes me is that he's a proponent of something we might call a holistic type of education, where you are not just let's say something, you're not just doing just something theoretical, intellectual, but you have, if I understand it correctly, you have to go through the entire, all the stages, which include manual work as well, right? So much more holistic view of education and, right?
Indeed, yes. He includes, he starts off, and some folks have accused him of pedantry, right? Being so focused on little rules, because his theory of how one can really penetrate into your heart starts off with the body. He's very incarnational in this. He's really interested in the body and the importance of training and educating the body. And as you said, this very holistic understanding of education. So table manners, posture, how one dresses, how one speaks to peers, to people who are higher in rank than you, than people who are lower in rank than you, people who have greater virtue than you, people who have less virtue perhaps than you might have, though he's always cautioning humility. All of these things seem at first to some to be pedantry, to be nitpicking and focused on these. But his theory, as he gives us, is that when we can discipline these small matters, when we can discipline our bodies, we are in effect weeding the garden of our heart. We're taking these weeds out and leaving fertile soil for grace to come and plant virtues, and especially plant the virtues of charity, the virtue of charity or love, that then can grow, that grace can water and light this virtue of charity that can then be growing in our heart, and that the weeds of all these external bodily vices won't be choking it out. So he's very, it's a kind of holistic program. It can't be held up merely as intellectual, merely as spiritual or devotional. Preaching is a big part of this. He's practicing preaching. We know the other Victorians are. We know that music and visual arts are a big part of their education as well. And this mission into the world, Hugh goes off by invitation, visiting other religious houses, putting their houses in order. That is to say, helping the election of abbots, helping them reform. I was able to find a couple references to Hugh in other chronicles in which Hugh of St. Victor came and visited their house. Right, it wasn't included. The Victorians didn't make note of this, but other folks made note of it when Hugh came and visited them. So this is a lot. These things tied together in a very interesting way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Robert. Beautiful and enriching.
Thank you for these questions, Adrian. Sort of pulling some things out that I probably should have touched on